Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and today we've got a fun little project ahead of us. We are going to get some aquarium rocks into the Pseudotropheus saulosi tank to make that look a little bit nicer. It's been looking sparse ever since we set it up, so I'm going to take you through that process, show you what we did, so stay tuned. Alright, so before I show you the tanks, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we did. We went to a local landscaping store and they had lots of rocks, big huge piles of rocks. The kids are climbing all over them, but we found some great sandstones, some great river rocks of all different sizes, and so we found some of those things and they were really cheap. And so the nice thing is, when you go to a pet store, a lot of times you're looking at $3 to $4 a pound for rocks for an aquarium. Here they were 19 cents a pound, so we were able to get a lot more rock for a lot less money, and that was awesome. So the first thing that we did when we brought the rocks home is we soaked them in buckets and we scrubbed them down. We scrubbed the surfaces down with a wire brush and made sure that they were going to be safe for the aquarium, and then we soaked them overnight, tested water pH to make sure that the water chemistry wasn't changing, both in terms of pH and water hardness, and so it was good there. We went through and we did our muriatic acid test where we scratched the rocks with a knife, making sure that they weren't soft, they weren't flaking off, there wasn't anything coming off of them, and then pouring the muriatic acid on there to look for fizzing. Fizzing isn't necessarily an awful thing if you're keeping African cichlids like we do in a lot of our tanks. That just means it's going to add a little bit of hardness to the water, something that we actually encourage in those tanks. But if you were running like a pistos or something like that, that might not be the best thing to do. So stay tuned and we're going to show you what we did. All right, so here we have some sandstone, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to test this rock to see how it impacted total dissolved solids and how it impacted pH. So let me try to do this without getting the shadows in the way here. You can see here we're at about 152, so this is right in line with our tap water, so we're not getting a lot of dissolved minerals in the water here. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing with pH. Gonna move this around. Remember, our normal pH for our water is right around an 8 or an 8.1. And not much is changing. We're at an 8.2, so it went up just a little bit from an 8.81 to a solid 8.2. So it really didn't have an effect on the pH either. All right, so here is the before of this tank, and you can see the saulosi tank has always been very sparsely hardscaped. I had a couple of terracotta pots, a little fake structure there, sponge filter, that's it. So we're going to try to make this tank look a little bit better with the rock that we got. So one of the things I did before I put rock in the tank, I want to get an idea of how I want to stack this stuff. And so I've got a couple stacks here. I just put them on the floor. And the nice thing about the floor is, because there are 1 foot tiles, I kind of have an idea of how much space this is going to take. I know our 40-gallon breeder is 3 feet long by 18 inches deep. So this is not necessarily going to run all the way around the back. It's going to run up the sides as well. But it gives us an idea of the footprint that we're looking at. And so now the job is to get this in the tank and make it look okay. All right, so here we have the after. We've added the rocks and looks good. The fish are taken to them pretty well. The saulosi seem to like them. We can see here, I went ahead and I pressed these rocks down pretty firmly into the sand. I kind of buried them so that they would not move. Obviously the big thing with any Mbuna and substrate is that they like to dig. And so the last thing we want is this pile of rocks coming down on top of them, because they dug out the sand and made the foundation unstable. So those rocks are in the sand pretty securely. They're on the actual bottom of the tank, and so if they do dig, it really shouldn't matter. So we can see here, even one of these females here, she's already in there. So they're interacting with it. The nice thing, this is sandstone, and so I don't anticipate too many problems. One of the things that we did when we went to our local landscaping place is we looked for sandstone, and they had some river rocks, which is these other two that are kind of protruding out a little bit. And one of the things that we do is take a knife to the rocks and see if it scratches real easily. And if it scratches super easy, that may mean that we're going to have pieces of rock coming off in the tank, or it's going to make the tank cloudy. So we try to make sure that that doesn't scratch easy. And then the other thing that's beneficial is to test for carbonate hardness, and one of the ways you can do that is by adding an acid to the rock to see if it fizzes, if it bubbles. A lot of people use vinegar. I don't tend to use it because I feel that as though using vinegar is hard to see the bubbles, and so I use muriatic acid. And so I'll scratch the rock, put a few drops of muriatic acid on the rock, and if it fizzes, it's not necessarily a terrible thing, especially if you've got African cichlids. It just means that there is going to be some potentially some carbonate hardness in that rock, and that it may add to the water hardness. Again, for these fish, that's actually not a bad thing, and so they like harder water. They like a higher pH, and this rock did not change the water chemistry when I tested it. And so all of this rock went in 5-gallon buckets. I split it up into 2 5-gallon buckets, filled the buckets up, left them for a few days, came back and tested the pH, tested the water hardness, the TDS, and there was no change. So the pH started out at about 8.81, went to about an 8.2. And the water hardness, there was no change whatsoever. So we know, at least in the short term, that the rocks are not releasing significant amounts of minerals, and they're not changing the pH. The only other thing that we have to concern ourselves with then at that point is whether or not the rocks are going to be releasing any metals into the water. That's a little bit harder to deal with. You just have to kind of know which rocks to add. I'm not an expert in that, but I figured the river rocks were safe that we got from our local landscaping store, and the sandstone would do well in this setup. Now, would I add all this sandstone to an apistogramma tank where they like softer water with a lower pH? Probably not. But for this setup, for these fish, it should work out well long term, and we're excited. You know, this tank has looked pretty sparse ever since we set it up, and just to add a little bit of rock really kind of makes the tank a lot more interesting to look at. It's not perfect, and we're not necessarily done here, but it does add something to this tank, and it's an improvement. Not perfect, but certainly an improvement. So there you have it. That is the Pseudotropheus saulosi tank. Got some rock added. They seem to be liking it. So that was a fun project for us. We got that tank looking a little bit better. Again, it's not perfect. We are not hardscape experts, but the fish enjoy it. It looks a little bit nicer. It's a little bit more enjoyable to look at, and we're going to be doing that to other tanks as we go through the fish room and trying to make them look a little bit nicer, a better home for the fish that we keep. So if you like this video, share it, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.